You're listening to Earthkeepers Essentials, in which we revisit and reframe some of the more important and influential episodes that have shaped our thinking and influenced the ways that we love and care for the Earth. In this episode, we are representing a conversation with Wes Willison, the eldest son of my dear and lifelong college friends, John and Carol, all of whom I consider family. I've opted to revise and reframe this particular episode because my conversation with Wes was so honest and so deeply moving for me, as we talked about dealing with discouragement about all the really hard environmental, political, and social justice issues that we face in the world today. At one point, we even talked about the hard questions that Wes's generation have to grapple with when they make decisions about having children in the face of a dire climate future. Now, I should note here that now, a couple of years after we spoke of these things, Wes and his wife Hannah recently celebrated the birth of a baby girl. I'll note too that if you like what you hear in this episode, be sure to check out part 2 of the conversation, which you'll find listed as episode 106 on the podcast website at earthkeepers.online. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast.
Wes, my brother, it is so good to be with you as always.
Oh, and you as well.
I wonder if you could just maybe give our listeners a rundown of your current life situation, your family, your community, just to get us oriented.
Sure. I am in my house right now on Tulip Street on the border of Port Richmond and Kensington. This is the Delaware River watershed, traditionally Lenape land. I am a real estate agent in Philadelphia. I've been here since 2008. I originally moved to the area for undergrad. I attended Swarthmore College, met my wife there, my wife, Hannah Lehman. She's currently at the climbing gym in our neighborhood. She works at the climbing gym a few hours a week. I'm at home. We had an opportunity, a window of leaving the area, one in 2016. We ended up staying here in Philadelphia because I chose to go to seminary at Princeton, which was just right up 95, right up the highway. So this was a place where we could buy a home. We could stay here for the few years while we were in seminary. And then we chose to stay after that. We also had a window. We almost moved again. My wife is a doula. She almost went to midwifery school and we had a chance to leave then as well, but we ended up staying again. And we're still here in Philadelphia, and we're pretty deeply connected in our block and our neighborhood. We know our neighbors. We spend a lot of time with them. So that's a brief window into where I am. Is that helpful?
Well, I think that listeners who have been listening for a while know who you are and know that we are family. But I wonder, for our newer listeners, maybe you could tell us about your journey, and specifically because it's cogent to our conversation today, how you became more aware of and engaged in issues of earth care and the environment.
That's a good question. I am the child of John and Carol Willison, who are your dear friends from university, from Northwestern. We were a family in Evanston, Illinois until 2003, 2004, when we decided to leave the country. My parents took jobs sort of in the international church community in East Africa. I did 9th grade in Mombasa, Kenya, and then the rest of high school in Kampala, Uganda. I think all of my political awareness comes from that break from America. I remember that was 2003, and I was nestled in a pretty conservative Christian private school in the North Shore of Chicago. Post 2001, 9/11, the Iraq War starting up. I remember watching the videos of the bombs over Baghdad and sort of being mostly okay with that because that was the community I was with, right? Just sort of like, this is a necessary activity, this is a necessary war. When we left and we moved to East Africa, I remember that being a total cultural shock, right? Just in the sort of day-to-day life, but especially just being 13, 14 years old, starting to learn to think for myself and realizing that November 2004, as we're watching the election results come in, I was in a classroom in Mombasa Academy in Kenya and listening to my friends react to the news that George Bush had won again and how that was going to affect their families, right? And their experience of the world. But this was something happening on the totally other side of the globe, and their experience being the color skin that they were, the culture that they were, with the connections all the way up and down the eastern coast of Africa in Swahili culture and then up into the Middle East, what their experiences were really dramatically changed my outlook on what I'd always considered to be acceptable. There's sort of a joke in meme culture on the internet. When were you radicalized? What was the moment that radicalized you? I think it was then. I think it was, sitting next to a friend who I'd made in Kenya. His name was Hussein. As I'm listening to the American dialogue about Saddam Hussein and just sort of people with names like that, right? And trying to match those against each other, realizing I've really missed the mark in what I've been believing about how the world works. That was sort of the beginning. I think since then, just living in the lifestyle of somewhere like East Africa, realizing what to the rest of America looks like lack, to most of Africa just looks like enough. Like, you actually don't need quite as much to live a very happy and very peaceful lifestyle, and it doesn't have to be mapped against having as much or needing as much as someone in a large suburban SUV living on the outskirts of a major city. That doesn't need to be the center of what life looks like. And in fact, the more we're learning about the state of the world, that can't be, right? Also, that was sort of the time when I was hearing about uncomfortable truth, inconvenient truth, that's right. And starting then to think more broadly and ecologically. And then in university, of course, that's when I really started studying this full time and focusing on politics and political science. Ended up being my major.
And you actually even had another change in terms of your view of ecology and environment issues when you were in seminary, of all places. We've talked about it in the podcast, but tell us more about that.
Yeah, I went to seminary starting in 2016. Again, more with an eye on politics, specifically because of what was in the air in 2016. And I was surprised to find that Princeton Seminary was starting a project called the Farminary. A farm and a seminary, same thing, same project, where you would take seminary classes at a farm while learning about the land, learning agrarianism, right? Of course, reading people like Wendell Berry and Norman Wirsba, sure, but actually working with your hands in the compost, right? In the dirt every week before you start conversations on the reading materials, and taking these as co-substantive, right? That they're equally important to each other, that learning what it means to work with your body in the earth, noticing what you notice as you dig into the soil, is real material for understanding who God is and what God is doing in something like a text like we read on a page, right? What is the text of the earth? What does it mean to encounter the earth and encounter God in the humus, in the mess of everything that occurs in the earth, literally, not just as a metaphor, but literally. And that really challenged a lot of what I understood to be what I'd considered to that point my polis, right? It had mostly just included humans, had mostly just included people that I could talk to, right? People with cogent ideas, and realizing, no, one, there are so many people for whom that's not their experience of the world, and God loves them just the same. And that's also God's relationship to the entire planet, that one's ability to read or recite a set of beliefs does not affect God's love for you, and the earth reflects that. That farm had been a Christmas tree farm for a decade or more before the seminary purchased it and started to turn it into a classroom. Then it was a sod farm for a while once the soil could no longer grow Christmas trees. So the soil had become compacted until it was like a thick clay. So turning that over to become fertile again was a long years and years and years process, starting with worms and compost, right? So waste and worms was actually the key to the soil of that place becoming healthy again. Talk about an image of resurrection, but also forget images, actually just experience it, right? Smell what resurrection really smells like. See it at work, feel it when you pick that worm up, and against your better impulses, set it back down, right? Maybe your impulse is to squish and to run away and say, ew, but say, no, this is the glory of God. I remember that being mostly a surprise, and I owe so much to the Farminary for opening my eyes in a surprising way to something that I didn't know to expect. There's a way that God is moving in the world, is sort of Catholically, universally present in the earth in a way I didn't have a bead on. I didn't have eyes to see until that was revealed to me. I'm very grateful for that. I'm curious for you, when were you radicalized? How do you answer that question?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. I mean, I have to say I was born this way, right? I would say every deep encounter I've had with God, even prior to making any kind of faith commitment, happened in nature. For me, that's how I perceive God most readily, most really, and how I hear from God. So having grown up that way, I think really I had it maybe taught out of me, especially as I entered into more conventionally evangelical culture, which actually happened really beginning in college. And so for me, my priorities shifted to what's most important is people, saving souls, got to be a missionary, and bought all of that without really thinking critically about it. And I would say that it was in seminary at Regent College under the teachings of Peter and Miranda Harris that I got permission to think again about that important part of me and about how, in fact, creation was revelation and how, in fact, I had put the Bible as a text in a place of higher value than other ways that God is revealed. So I think that under their teaching, I got set free to, first of all, be who I am and to relate to God in ways that are more natural to me. So it was since that time that I've just gone deeper and deeper into it and perhaps returned to my original vocation in that sense, that I'm about earth care and I'm about helping people to understand the connections between faith praxis and creation around them. That said, I want to point people back to episode 73 from last year because you make a really great case for compost theology in particular, but for the importance of understanding the way that God and truth about God is expressed in nature. So hopefully people will go back and listen to that episode. We have a lot of guests on Earthkeepers podcast, sometimes because they're famous or because they've written a book. I want to talk to you because you are a normal guy.
Right.
You are a guy in his 30s, early 30s, and you are part of a generation that is dealing with issues of social justice and climate change in ways that are maybe more visceral and real and immediate because your generation is and will be facing the consequences of changes that are happening now. So I want to talk to you again on the podcast in this episode because you are a thoughtful person and you reflect on these things well. And I think you can offer some wisdom and encouragement for your generation in particular. As someone in your early 30s, your perspective, again, is profoundly impacted by issues of climate change, by political and economic instability. And I want to learn from you. I want to hear your perspective and your reflections on that because you've had to find ways to make sense, right? To understand how is it that I'm going to be walking forward? How can I live with integrity and with hope, really, into the future? Let me just start with a question. I hope it's not too broad, but what's it like to be part of a generation that frankly faces a more difficult future than your parents had to face?
I've sometimes joked that it feels like none of my friends are optimistic about the next 50 years, that all of us think things are getting worse and are just going to keep getting worse. I don't know if that's a coping mechanism or that's actually just as honest an assessment of the trajectory that we've observed so far, right? I do see 2016 as a watershed moment. I remember I was in college in 2008. It's a flashbulb memory. I remember where I was when we learned that Obama had been elected was sort of the pinnacle of optimism for my friends and I in college. We were in a bar on campus and people were partying. People were having a great time. There was a dance party broke out. We're like, wow, something is shifting. There's something that's changing in a direction we're really excited about. I don't think I've felt that since then. The rest of the term of Obama's presidency was sort of the beginning of this malaise of like, wait a second, there's something really off in the incentive structure, right? And the ways that Obama is being incentivized to behave and the ways that we're incentivized to act. And the things that get rewarded or punished do not look like the kinds of things that we had quote unquote hope in. So then when 2016 rolls around, I remember where I was when we learned that Trump was going to be elected. And that sort of was a similar intensity of emotion, but in the opposite direction. I was in seminary at that point. We had chapel that morning, the day after, and they just canceled classes because people couldn't focus. I think it was just the shock. It was just the sort of ground underneath your feet opening up, the sort of a trap door, and you don't know where the bottom is anymore. Of like, wait a second, I actually don't, something in my epistemology of like what this country is or how we decide on things is broken. I don't know what to stand on anymore. There are pat answers you can give in a response to that. I understand. And I've heard them from plenty of people in older generations. People who are saying, oh, well, you weren't there in 1980 when Reagan was elected or things like that. But I think that experience emotionally, it was a tidal shift. And since then until now, it's felt of a piece that the arrival of the pandemic, the growing sense of disappointment with, say, I'm in Pennsylvania, so disappointment with someone like John Fetterman, right, is pretty palpable. People were working really hard to get the vote out, get really excited about the ways John Fetterman specifically was going to change the conversation in a climate sense about the kinds of ways American policy could shift around climate. And it's been actually pretty much a 180 from that, to say nothing of this sort of callousness towards the concerns arising around Gaza and Palestine. To conflate all of this is unfair, but at the same time, it is how it feels. That the feeling does come from all of it sort of in a mass. And that's kind of the way the media tunnel just passes stories like this over and over. But then in a city like Philadelphia, if I'm just to take this local, where I am, we see what's happening in neighborhoods like Kensington, which has extreme drug activity, extensive gang activity, a lot of violence, and a lot of people stuck in really, really difficult circumstances, and the city not being able to get a handle on it. That efforts over and over years and years, things just keep coming back empty. And it feels very similar. Just feels like it's all sort of lining up in the same direction, where the anticipation is like, yeah, this isn't going to get better. And then you check in a year later and you're like, yep, things didn't get better. So I'm going to keep believing that until I see otherwise. That sense of dread is why a lot of my friends are getting off of social media, getting off of reading the news, are maybe retreating in one sense into a more quietist political attitude. Maybe just stop reading so much, stop engaging so broadly. Maybe just tune out the news of the student protests on campuses right now just because it's too painful to anticipate anything good will come of it. And then on the other hand, to just radicalize further, just read farther and farther into a lot of things that maybe long term we don't necessarily have a justification for violence. But if you're this hopeless, and there are works out there on the internet, and there's all kinds of people making money on YouTube or whatever right, left-wing sites, you can just sort of see the efforts of people to sort of regain some sense of control over this constant stream of bad news. And that the result could sometimes be some really intense political responses. So it's hard to talk about this stuff without just feeling really dark and really sad.
Well, it's hard to pay attention. It's hard to notice that place in you that has in some ways given up, right?
Right.
That does not actually believe that action is possible, action that leads to significant change. I mean, this morning, watching the news, I saw that Nikki Haley was one of the last Republican leaders to say now that she will vote for Trump. I mean, Nikki Haley, of all people. And I'm just like, yeah, of course, right? It just seemed unsurprising to me. So nothing surprises me anymore, right? Because I just find myself not believing anymore in the possibility of change. You know, I will say that in the last episode, we interviewed Brian McLaren, and he makes a point about the news. He says he at one time was a news addict, and I think probably many of us are, but he said he had to stop because what is he really learning? What is new about the news? There are people who are bad who will always be bad. There are politicians who fail who will continue to fail. So his stance is, why do we expend the energy on that when we could, in fact, turn our energy to other things? And in his view, it's not about finding ways to hope, but finding ways just to be a better person. His stance is turn off the news for one thing and focus on just being the best person you can, living well despite the circumstances, and finding ways to make changes you can make in your context. You have to do that, because otherwise it's despair and retreat, and we can't do that.
I think a lot about surprise, just sort of as like a cornerstone of my theology at this point, that surprise for me is one of the first indicators of the Spirit's activity. That when I'm being surprised by something, could be disgust, it could be shock, it could just be joy, that surprise is always worth noting. I think with regards to just the intensity of some of the news and some of the experiences that I encounter, the forest fire is surprising, right? You see these massive flames of this whole ecology going up in flames. But there's also the surprise, like I just described earlier, of the worm in the ground. And that's a different category. It's a different kind. And I don't want to numb my capacity to be surprised by things. Of all the places that could be surprising, like what if, regardless of political party, like who knows who it could be next that has a vision for a more ecologically inclusive politics? I don't know. I'm ready to be surprised on that. And it feels like I'm not alone in that.
You have struggled with depression at times. I'm wondering, has that depression been tied up with these issues that we've been talking about?
Oh, very much. Yes.
Because I know for my daughter's generation, she's in her 20s, that's absolutely true. Depression and anxiety is such a big issue among her friends, and a lot of it has to do with present circumstances and the prospects that they face for the future. What's your take on it?
I would concur. I mean, it's never just one thing, of course, but if you really are trying to pay attention to issues, take your pick of which one, let alone pile them all into a single basket and try to eat it as a meal every morning when you pick up your phone. Of course, you would be emotionally numb if you weren't feeling some of the darkness of what we are encountering every day. For me, the antidotes have been, one, to reduce the intake, and paired with that is practicing, I guess the word is confidence or patience with my own needs, confidence in that what I need right now is some space, is to back off, and the world will be okay. The world will actually be worse off if I'm not okay. It makes sense. I would never treat myself this way if I were someone else. I would never say to someone else, no, you need to keep considering these things. You must force yourself to stare at these things, even if it's wreaking havoc on your mental health. I would never do that to someone else. And so it's learning to be able to say that to myself. I can put this down. I could block this website or uninstall this app or whatever I need to do to get some space, because these are all still windows. I'm looking through a series of portals at various things that are beyond my actual physical space. What can I do to pay attention to where I really am, where my body is, people that I can reach with my arms, and the ways that they're caring for me, trying to show me that they care for me, even if I can't necessarily perceive it. That's been where activities like climbing, tending to bees, riding my bike, being with my dogs, walking the neighborhood. I have Sunday scaries on Sunday nights. I host people, we watch horror movies together. That may seem counterintuitive to this whole depression thing. It actually can be really helpful to watch a horror movie and see that someone else has given a lot of thought to something that may be causing you anxiety, right? And you're like, oh, wow, look, here's a horror movie about it. And this is a really fun way to think about it and to actually be scared with other people. And yet it turns off and we can walk away. We can have a snack. We can go back to our loved ones, go to sleep and move on. These are all mechanisms that I've found that help me personally. They may sound ridiculous to other people, and that's totally fine. But if you're dealing with these things, you have to find coping mechanisms. That's kind of been the bulk of the work of the last few years, really since the pandemic, of trying to figure out which of these are sustainable and not numbing me to the point of inaction or of totally removing myself from the things that I really do believe in, but are still coping enough that I can sustainably show up. and not just always be drifting back into depression.
For you and Hannah, have thoughts of the future impacted your decision about whether to have kids?
Yes, this is a live question. I'm not sure how much I feel ready to talk about it. What I think I can say is, I think this is where my faith in God is tested the most, in that I can grapple with my faith on my own terms when it's me at stake in a different way than when I grapple with the future of, say, my child and the kind of world that I'd be inviting a child into. To have faith in a God that loves that person is different than having faith in a God who loves me. I know they seem the same, but they're not the more I spend time with this question. And to be actually able to say, no, I entrust this person to God is kind of one of the only ways I feel comfortable having a child, because of how dark some of these problems seem. And of course, I know the child would probably have all kinds of wonderful influences and things like that, but also maybe not, right? Maybe the world would be better off by having slightly less people, and I could be a parent in other ways to plenty of other people who are already present. This is an open question. Hannah and I still talk about this. We are not sure. We are in our early to mid-30s, so it's a live question. And it also comes back to just questions of affordability and money and things like that. There's just so little support for parents. If we were to have a child, it's an ecological question. It would be dramatically different lifestyle, different demands on our neighbors, on our friends, on our family. And so we'd have to reshape our life were a kid to arrive. We look forward to that. We would love for that to be the case, but also definitely not counting out the possibility that maybe we'll be parents in a different way. Maybe it'll look very different for us than what we have been and are still told we should want. So we'll see.
Your family, and you in particular, have had a huge impact on my fatherhood. In the days when I lived in and around your family and holding you all the time, carrying you around, was when that deep place in me was ignited, that I cannot live my life without this, without loving someone like this, without caring for them and being entrusted with their well-being. And that for me actually was complicated because I'm a single man, and also my values told me that I was not comfortable bringing a child into the world given future prospects. So in the end, God provided one of those ways that you're talking about, other ways to be a parent. And it's my main motivation behind adopting my daughter when I lived in Turkey. She needed a home and I needed to be a dad. So it all worked out. But yeah, so much of that has to do with what I learned from you even before you were one.
Yeah, before I was conscious. That's amazing.
Well, we do have to get to your work of gun conversion with Shane Claiborne. Tell me about that and what it means.
Sure. So Shane Claiborne is a neighbor. He lives maybe half mile from me. Simple way is about a half mile from where Hannah and I live. He lives in a much more intense, center of a lot of the activity that I was describing with Kensington, right? So there's more violence, more needles on the street, more people on the street, just a more happening area, a lot of cops. In the middle of all that, Shane has a shop called Raw Tools. RAW is the reverse of war, right? What they do is they pick up guns from Department of Homeland Security, from police departments, and break them down, chop them up, melt them, reform them into garden tools or jewelry or icons or sculptures. It's a metalworking shop. So if you come in on any day that we're in the shop, you'll be able to help with the process. There's racks and storage bins full of all these old gun parts. And there's all these tools in these different rooms. There's a remembrance wall where people who have lost people to gun violence, who have come through the shop, they leave their note, they leave their candle, they leave the name. Out back, we have a little furnace. Occasionally we'll get mothers or parents or teachers, people who've been affected by gun violence, very close to them, right? Like if a child committed suicide or some other situation, they'll bring the weapon and Shane will sort of walk them through dismantling it, pastoring them through that. It's powerful. These are objects that act in the world. It's hard to say that a gun has agency, but the presence of a gun does change the kinds of things that might occur. I don't even mean decisions that people make. We hear about this all the time, of kids picking up a gun and accidentally wounding themselves, if not killing themselves. The gun is an actant, right? It is bringing about outcomes in the world because of its shape, because of its form, its presence as an object. And the work of changing that, of reducing the kinds of outcomes that can be possible because of the shape of this physical metal object, is an act of hope. What else could you call this? Just then to say that this object will never do that again. Of all the death that could occur in this world, this object won't be a part of that in that way anymore. The things that this gun makes easy are way more difficult now. It's not going to happen that way. Can't do it again. When you come to the shop and you notice, if you understand the ecology of Philadelphia violence and drug activity, this shop is right at the corner where it's like the heart of everything. It's Kensington and Allegheny. It's just a few steps away from that is the Raw Tools shop. And so if you come, you'll experience this full bore fire hose. You'll experience everything that this work is about. Just even by parking your car and walking to the shop, you'll experience the kinds of despair that the work is resisting against.
Seems to me that maybe even more important than the fact that it's one less gun to cause damage is that the process and then the product are powerful symbols. And it seems to me that people are hungry for symbology, which represents some new way of thinking and being.
Neither Shane nor I nor any of the other laborers in the shop, people who actually work on this stuff day to day, none of us come from an artistic training background. So I will say the objects that are produced aren't quite as refined as you might see coming out of the metalworking shops of Temple University, which is a few miles away, or Penn, which is across the city, Drexel. That's where you'll find the real artisans, the real excellent metalworkers. This project is first political. And then you start to see, okay, well, what forms are we actually choosing to make? Which forms do we want to see present in the world? What opportunities do we want the things that we make to make easier? And that's where the work of a really good craftsman comes in. We are not very good craftsmen. We are good enough and learning more. But it's really, really exciting when someone who really knows what they're doing with metal comes into the shop and then starts to work maybe with a gun, and they haven't necessarily worked with guns before. I have to say, guns are fantastic objects of engineering. They're extremely well made. The kind of craft and thought and understanding that goes into the production of these arms is incredible. And as soon as you touch it, you can feel the quality, especially if some of these much larger objects that come into the shop from Department of Homeland Security. But nonetheless, they are oriented in a specific direction that we don't believe in. And just because the technique is excellent doesn't mean it's in a wise direction. And that's words to live by in real estate and everything. Shane wrote a great book called Common Prayer. It's a take on the Book of Common Prayer for what Shane calls ordinary radicals. So Christians who are working in the gutters of the world to find the love and the life in places where you might overlook. And what I've realized reading that book, reading the actual Book of Common Prayer, and just looking at Christian tradition, we have sacraments for various pieces of what is most important in life. Marriage, communion, baptism, funerals, things like that. I don't know what sacraments we have around, say, the making of an object. I don't think that's really considered a sacramental experience. Sometimes these moments when people are taking a gun apart or making something new feels holy in a way that I don't have the language or the rituals to actually acknowledge. I'm making things up. And that's a pretty rare experience in a faith as old as Christianity, to be like, oh my goodness, I've hit the edge of what we're able to actually articulate tradition around. We don't have a tradition around this. Or if we do, it's not making its way to Philadelphia.
Well, it's not, but it is, because the fact is that what goes on in that metal shop is sacramental. You're creating processes of significance for decommissioning a gun.
Yeah.
Very symbolic and powerful. I think I'm hearing you say that there's even a sacrament of processing loss of a loved one who's murdered. I mean, how powerful is that to be able to reconstruct, recreate a gun into something else as part of that process of grieving and moving on?
Yeah, I think about Jesus as a carpenter. Did he ever work on crosses? Did he and his father ever build those? Was there ever a contract out from the government saying we need good woodworkers to make high-quality crosses? Because we'll pay for it. It's just an object. You're not responsible for what happens to it. Crosses don't kill people. The Roman Empire does. What would Jesus have said? I don't know. What about the cross after the crucifixion? What happened to it? Did the disciples go and take it down and burn it? How many other people died on that cross? Was that at the beginning or the end of that cross's lifespan? What happened to old crosses? Were they discarded by the empire and other people used them? Would different factions use crosses for what they're intended for? What if the disciples took that cross and split the beams into boards, made a table out of it, served communion to each other?
Seems to me that the questions that we're talking about right now, in some ways, have everything to do with the future of the church. Because if we don't do that, what's going to happen in terms of the relevance of the church and the purpose of Christian community if we don't rethink our faith practice?
Yeah, for the people of God.
Earthkeepers podcast is a production of Circlewood. Our executive producer is James Amidon, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our communications manager, and our music was created by Forrest Reed and Levgen Potovsky. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host, and I'm really grateful for the time you've spent listening to this episode. Help us expand our reach by following or subscribing to this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And be sure to go to earthkeepers.online to sign up for our podcast newsletter. And if you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, it would be great if you could send them a link. In any case, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers podcast.